Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 9 of our English 5795 online course. In this week's video, I want to continue walking us through our transition from our weeks of reading and discussion around theoretical frames, methodologies, and inquiries around the rhetoric of space and place, and into your independent inquiry projects, which will culminate in your final paper for the course. So this week, we're going to be focusing on the methodological frame for your inquiry project, which will be ethnographic methods. And we'll look together at the rest of the schedule because there's some funny weeks coming up where you're going to be doing some more independent work. And then we'll finish off with our mini lecture on the readings. So without any further ado, I'm going to switch over to our Canvas view and we'll get right to it. Okay, so here we are in week 9. We've got a few readings that we'll talk about in a little bit. You'll see here too that I have included 3 published ethnographic studies of various locations or places. So these 3 readings here, Death and Vegetarians, Moonlight Bunny Ranch, and the Ethnography of Urban Design. These are all examples of published articles that use ethnography as their key methodology. So I just have them up there as a sample for you guys to look at so that you can see how to write an ethnographic paper if you've never done one before. You'll notice too that this week is your final reading response. Reading response 9 is due. Again, we finished up our reflective discussions last week, so this will also be your final reading response. Then we'll really be jumping into the inquiry project. So this week, let me talk through how the week's laid out, and then I'll show you over the next weeks how things will unfold. So for this week's schedule, you have your weekly instructor video, which you're already watching. 2 chapters by Heath and Street, Shirley Bryce Heath and Brian Street, are really seminal authors within ethnographic studies in rhetoric and composition. So these are like the OG ethnographers for us rhetoricians. So we have a couple of chapters from their book on ethnography, an excerpt that details how to take field notes. And this is really important because that will be your primary data collection for this inquiry project, will be field notes. And then, of course, the sample ethnographies and your reading response. So really just watching your instructor video and getting those readings sort of internalized. Then you can start thinking about your methods section. So this is not anything you're going to turn into me, but at the end of this week, you should have ideas percolating for how you're going to take your field notes at the site that you have chosen to do your inquiry for your paper. More on that in a second. But first, let's look at the rest of the semester because there are some interesting weeks coming up and I want to explain to you how things are going to go over the course of this inquiry project. So next week, week 10, the main thing that I want you to work on is your proposal for this inquiry. And what you'll need to do for then is have a working annotated bibliography. Now, next week, I will not post a video, but rather I will keep a little bit extra time available to conference with you. So if you would like to talk to me about your inquiry proposal, if you'd like to talk to me about any of the sources that you've started to collect or ideas you have for the project moving forward, over the next few weeks, that's what we're going to do. Instead of me giving a mini lecture video, I'm going to be available for conferences. So please set up a conference with me over the next couple of weeks if you'd like to talk through your project. And I hope you do, because I think it will be interesting to see what everybody's going to be working on. Now, when you write your proposal, it's just like a page or so. I think I asked for like 1 to 2 pages. And what you want to do there is tell me what you plan to do. So it's really very basic. You've got your reading base that you're going to sort of sketch out with your annotated bibliography. Your loose proposal will be, what is your idea for this study? Where are you going to do your research? How are you going to get access to take your field notes? How will you capture your field notes? And what are some of the aspects of the space that you're going to really be focusing on? So that's next week. In week 11, again, there will be no video posted. I will be available for conferences around your inquiry projects. But over the next couple of weeks, once you've got your proposal set and turned into me, and you've gotten like feedback from me if needed, like yes, no, or maybe you should think about this. Weeks 11 and 12 and even 13, are for your actual research. So I'm going to be very light on the requirements of what I'm going to ask you to do. And what I want you to do is to be at your site, at your location. What is the space that you're going to be researching, taking field notes, being there? Okay, so that's going to be why it's a little lighter. There's no video for week 11. Continue your reading and take your field notes. Do the research. Now, this will continue into week 12. So we have a couple of weeks coming up here that are just set aside for you to be on your site, at your space, take your notes. No video from me, because what I want you to be doing is collecting your field notes, your observations. And then your field notes will be due around Thanksgiving break. If you have your 3 sets of field notes, which I think is what I'm asking you to deliver, yes, you need to have 3 or 4 observations recorded in your field notes. So that's like about an hour each time. So it's like at least an hour each week. Go to your site, do your observations. You can observe for longer, but that's what I want you to shoot for the minimum requirement here. You can turn those in before Thanksgiving break if you have them completed, or you can take the week of Thanksgiving, which is week 13, and you can complete them if you so choose. Okay? So either way, your field notes should be completed before we start week 14, because this is where we're going to be drafting and doing peer review for this final paper, which will be due week 15. Okay? So that's kind of the big picture overview. Now, let's get into the methods. We're going to talk about the methodology for your project. The methods for inquiry are quite specific. I am asking you to do an ethnographic study that considers the rhetoric of a particular space or place. So what is the meaning being made in this space or place? And I'm asking you to consider theoretical frames that we've already talked about. Here in Heath and Street Chapter 1, you have a few more things that you can consider, that you could add to your list of things to pay attention to in your space or place. So Heath and Street are going to talk about multimodal literacies, which are distinct from multimodalities. So multimodal literacies are going to include systems of representation or communication, written, oral, visual, gestural. Multimodalities are the actual technologies whereby those communications get distributed. Now, they're going to talk about organizations versus institutions in terms of what you can expect in format, organization, structure. I used the word organization twice there, but hopefully you can hang with me. And they're also very clear that they are giving us 3 examples of types of human interaction that one can centralize when doing ethnographic research, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. So while you could consider looking at individuals as they pursue expertise in a space, or looking at how groups make their group identity, or how institutions handle something like formal education, or indeed any sort of mission, public mission. Those are things you could look at, but they aren't the only things. All right. Excuse me. A little drippy today. In chapter 2, Heath and Street are really going to get into what ethnography is and who ethnographers are, to examine some of these social interactions that they just sort of outlined in chapter 1. So, I love this. Ethnographers are curious people. They're constant learners. They are always asking, what is happening here? And then they're paying attention to see what is happening here. And that is what I want you to do in this inquiry project. You will be ethnographers in whatever space or place you have chosen or that you're thinking about doing this investigation in. You want to be asking the question, what is happening here? Now, in your field notes, that means you need to be very ruthless and clear with yourself about what is actually happening, not what is not happening. Oh, well, I saw that the man at the counter did not ask a question. We're not interested in what is not happening. That will come later, perhaps, in your analysis, but when you're doing your observation, you need to record what is happening. And think about the different ways that you can bring your sort of unconscious bias to the observation situation. Comparing and contrasting can be very valuable as an analytical tool, but it can also distort what is happening because we are putting the weight of value judgment on an occurrence that perhaps doesn't need that value judgment attached to it. The emic versus the edict perspectives. So another way to say this is like the insider versus the outsider perspective. The emic perspective is that insider perspective. If you are going to be observing and analyzing a space in which you identify as a member or an insider, if you're very familiar with this space, then you'll be approaching it with an emic perspective. Whereas the edict perspective is coming in as an outsider, not identifying as a part of a community. So, for example, for myself, if I observe a writing classroom, I am absolutely observing it from an emic perspective because I identify as a writing instructor. I'm very familiar with many of the practices that one would expect to see in a writing classroom. Now, if I went to, say, let's see, I'm trying to think. If I went to the electronic music show, the big one downtown, I've never actually been there, and I don't really listen to electronic music, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, I don't know. But if I went to the electronic music show and attended a couple of the performances, I would totally be coming in from an edict perspective, an total outsider. Come on. This is not my scene, but I could observe it all the same. Okay? So there's different challenges depending on which perspective you're going to take. If you're using the emic perspective, the insider's perspective, you will be faced with the challenge of making the familiar strange. So you'll be faced with, I need to make these things which seem very normal to me strange and objects of inquiry. So I need to write everything down. I need to not take anything for granted. I need to pretend like I'm an alien who's never seen a writing classroom before. what is the teacher doing, and record it that way with that same level of detachment. If I'm using an edict perspective, it's almost the reverse. I need to make the strange familiar. I need to consider that there are reasons for behaviors, practices, communications that I don't know yet, but that certainly do exist. So just something to think about as you are getting ready to approach your field site and take your field notes to get at some of the rhetoric of a particular place. Consider whether you're an insider or an outsider, and then start to deal with your unconscious bias ahead of time so that it doesn't cloud your observations. Now, on that note, pre-actions, stuff to do this week before you actually go to your site and start observing. First of all, obtain access. Now, if you're going to a public place that doesn't really require any pre-access, fine. You can just go. You can just show up and make your observations. But make sure you have the ability to observe on the site. So if you were going to look at a classroom, you would absolutely need the instructor's permission and perhaps even some students' permission if you end up taking notes on their particular behaviors. If you were going to, say, an event that requires, even now because we are in COVID times, you may need to make sure that you have the appropriate health access. Do you need to wear a mask? Are you required to have a vaccination? Do you have to go online and fill out some kind of pre-checklist to make sure that your health is A-okay? These are the things that we need to think about. Now, if you are going to be observing a virtual site, some of these physical considerations might not apply, but you still might need to make sure you have access and permission to observe. So if you're watching, say, people interact in a chat room, or if you want to observe a meeting or a group that holds its meetings via Zoom right now, something like that, you need to make sure that you still have permission to be taking your field notes and using what you see for research purposes. Now, nothing we discuss in our class, nothing you present to our class will be available publicly. It's only for our educational purposes, but it's still something to consider as you move forward into your observation sites. Now, we talked about your unconscious biases. Record your assumptions now before you go to your site. Is it an EMIC? Is it an edict perspective? What do you think you're gonna see? What are you assuming that you will observe? Do you already know stuff about this site? What skills do people use in this space? Where are you in terms of your predetermined posture towards this site? Now, all that happens pre-observation. Then you're going to take some actions on site. Over the course of at least 3 weeks, 3 to 4 observations, you will take notes, details of the whole space. Oftentimes people find it helpful to write 2-column notes where you write the more objective observations on one side and more subjective reflections and questions on the other side. And you'll see that as you do the reading on field notes this week. You might also find it helpful to draw a map of the space and then start to chart how people move through it, especially if you're considering embodiment or even a kairos as a theoretical frame. Then you want to describe the activities that you see in as much detail as possible and think about how to quickly record whether or not any people who are interacting do you need to note what they're wearing? Do you need to note body posture? Do you need to know volume of speaking, or if they're not speaking, how they are writing things down? So these are all things that you want to put into your field notes. And then record any conversations you hear or have permission to record. all of that becomes your data, your primary source, as it were. As you put this together in your paper, then you will be doing peer review with classmates. You can talk to me, of course, in our conference times, getting clarity or seeing if anyone has any questions about what you're finding. Because oftentimes we do tend to confuse causation with correlation. And so we want to make sure that we're not doing that here, but that we are making necessary connections to be able to create a claim in our inquiry papers. Then we write up the data. You can free write based on your notes. You can use narrative description. First person is completely feasible within ethnographic research. In fact, it's encouraged because you are a participant observer. So think about how you want to frame that. And as you look at the sample papers that we have posted this week, you'll be able to see how other scholars handle that voice as they describe their research processes. Okay, so I think that about does it. Enjoy digging into the fascinating world of ethnographic research methods. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me or set up a conference. I'm available via Zoom on most days. So if you just shoot me an email, let me know when you're available. We'll figure something out. It doesn't have to be this week. It can be next week. Over the next couple of weeks, we will be having opportunities to conference about this project. So I hope you guys are staying warm and cozy on this dreary fall day, and I will see you in conferences. Bye, everybody.